Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Module 8 lecture. In this module, we will discuss Chapter 12, Intro to Psychological Skills Training. Now, I have to say this is definitely one of my favorite, not only chapters, but also module lectures to present, because now we start to look at things from a practical standpoint. What that means is that up until now, we've covered a lot of theories, a lot of approaches, but now it's really when we get to see how some of the skills that we've talked about, how they're actually used to help improve performance, satisfaction, and obviously enjoyment in sport. And I think that's where hopefully a lot of the things that we've talked about thus far in the semester, they really start to click and make sense in your head. But before we introduce the concept of psychological skills and how they are used, we need to talk about one very important concept: mental toughness. Now, we've talked a lot about how sport athletes communicate differently than maybe those that don't compete in sport, but also what we need to focus on is the concept of mental toughness. I think it goes without saying that mental toughness is something that for a long time has been embedded in sport and will continue to be embedded in sport. And that's a good thing. But at the same time, we're going to talk about today how some of the negatives that are associated with a high degree of mental toughness, how those things can not only make it difficult to allow athletes to look into aspects of mental health, but as it relates to the conversation we're having today, allow athletes to embrace mental toughness. So let's look at a definition. Let's look at our definition here of mental toughness. We define mental toughness as an athlete's ability to focus, rebound from failure, cope with pressure, and persist in the face of adversity. It is a form of mental resilience. We've talked a lot about how environments and a lot of other factors shape how athletes perform, enjoy, and perceive self-satisfaction in the sport that they're in. So, of course, a high degree of mental resilience is good. Mentally tough athletes have a high sense of self-belief and an unshakable faith that they can control their own destiny. Not too long ago, we talked about different roles of leadership, both informal roles, informal roles. It's definitely a good thing to have those leaders have a high degree of mental toughness in order for them to lead in the way that they need to. Athletes with mental toughness can remain relatively unaffected by competition or adversity. Again, that brings up the point that different environments can shape athletes, some athletes, particularly those that have a low degree of mental toughness. In the text, there's a reference to something called the 4C model of mental toughness. Essentially what this is another way to look at the concept of mental toughness. It breaks down mental toughness into 4 C's: control, commitment, challenge, confidence. Control in the sense that there's a healthy amount of control, particularly a control that things can be controlled, many things can be controlled at once, so many aspects within competition, and that there's an influence of the person on other aspects of the sport, on other athletes, versus the other way around, which would mean that the sport itself is controlling the athlete. Someone with a high degree of mental toughness, like you saw in the earlier slide, they remain unfazed to the fact that they're going to change in how they perform. They are committed to their goals. They expect adversity and they know things can get tough, but they're committed to winning, committed to being the best version of themselves, perhaps the best teammate, the best star on their team. They understand that with adversity comes challenges, and the challenges, they see those challenges as not only potential threats for opportunities as for growth, but also threats that they need to overcome, again, to evolve in those ever-changing environments, even within the same competition or game. And then again, just to reiterate the concept of confidence, self-belief in spite of setbacks. Again, regardless of adversity, athletes with high degree of mental toughness, they continue to push through. They continue to believe in themselves even when things seem bleak or when things get really difficult. So now let's look at the other side of mental toughness. We refer to this as the dark side of mental toughness. I said that sometimes athletes with a high degree of mental toughness, not only do they have a difficult time talking about or embracing discussions related to mental health, but again, related to what we're talking about today, they have a hard time embracing the techniques that we're going to talk about today, the techniques that we're going to get into. So I really like the 2 points I have here for you. First one being, although mental toughness is typically perceived as a desirable or positive quality, we know that if an athlete is unable to communicate when he or she is in some sort of difficulty, whether it's physical or mental, injury, illness, overtraining, these are things that become more common. And there you see again on the second bullet, more of a reference to mental health counseling, right? For a long time, and even now in a lot of places, there's a stigma in which athletes and coaches of many sports, they see any complaints or any feelings of sadness, anxiety, depressive feelings as signs of weakness. And that's not the case. Again, we need to normalize a conversation, at least now moving forward, based on everything we know. We need to normalize the ability to have a conversation as it pertains to mental health. So now that we understand, and I'm sure a lot of you understood that even before we dove into it today, but you have a better, more concrete understanding of what mental toughness is and how the dark side of mental toughness can not only make it difficult to have these mental health related conversations, but also to embrace psychological skills training. We need to not only start talking about what psychological skills training is and what those skills are, but also start looking into some of the benefits. So when we work with athletes who are resilient, who have a high degree of mental toughness and maybe are more resilient to psychological skills training, how we, working with future athletes, can encourage those athletes to embrace psychological skills training. Because again, working to optimize athletes just on the physical level, helping them reach the best physical versions of themselves, is only a piece of the puzzle, because again, they need to be just as mentally sharp as they are physically sharp in order to succeed. Psychological skills training, PST for short, refers to the systematic or consistent practice of mental or psychological skills. And we're going to talk about a lot of these skills throughout the remainder of the semester, and especially focus on some particular skills today for the purpose of enhancing performance, increasing enjoyment, or achieving greater self-satisfaction. Now, that's really important. And that's that second piece of that definition I do want to spend a little bit of time on because I think very often we think of skills, mental skills that athletes may use for sport. We almost always associate it with performance. We think, oh, they're doing that because they want to improve their performance. And many times that may be true, but it's very possible that they're doing those skills just to enjoy the sport again, because they very well might be performing already at a high level, or they may just want to feel as if they're getting more out of the sport. And I think it goes without saying that sometimes as a result of that, if their focus is increasing enjoyment, increasing self-satisfaction, performance increases anyway. So those things are tied together, but just keep in mind that performance isn't the only possible goal that someone may have for using these skills. These skills include methods and techniques that come from different types of resources. Obviously they're stemming from behavioral psychology as a focal point. And, if you're still not sure kind of the things that I'm talking about, start thinking about things along the lines as potential goal setting, imagery, relaxation. And I know we've mentioned maybe a couple of these early on, particularly when we talk about arousal, stress, and anxiety, but that's the kind of things that we're talking about here. Different guidelines, sometimes guidelines related to age, related to sport, have been established to make these skills, these methods more effective. And I think that's important because, again, if you just develop these skills and tell athletes go use them without giving them any sort of structure, you can only wish for them to be as effective as they could be. But the fact that guidelines do exist, I think bodes well for the implementation of PST skills. And to no surprise, although there are multiple reasons for doing PST, performance is obviously usually the main reason why an athlete would implement PST. Not to beat a dead horse here, but of course, aside from the physical side of sport, the psychological factors associated with sport is very important. So of course, it's, I cannot stress enough, just as important to train with these skills, to implement these skills as it might be to get in the weight room, to watch film, to be able to know what a coverage is, what a certain drill is, what certain play. These skills, particularly when they're implemented at the right time, can be just as effective in carrying those things out. And unfortunately, for a long time, this really didn't have a lot of publicity. So, you don't, even today, you don't see a lot of athletes dedicating a lot of time to these skills. And I think something that's a bit of a misnomer is the fact that most people think of psychological skills training as skills reserved for high-end athletes, right? Olympic athletes, D1 college athletes, professional athletes. And it's true that they may have more time and definitely more resources, particularly financially, to get that type of training. But these skills should and can be done for everyone. And in fact, you could argue that at an early age, if you're spending some time helping young athletes learn some of these skills, then they can take these skills that they're learning and apply them to other aspects of their life, which becomes very important for them as they're going through childhood, as they're going through adolescence, because as you know, they go through a lot of stress and ever-changing environments, particularly throughout someone's first 20 to 25 years of life. A couple important things to consider. During the season, how long do you spend physically training for competition? For a lot of athletes, this is a lot. During the season, how long do you spend practicing psychological skills for competition? Sometimes, and usually, unfortunately, for certain athletes, this is not a lot. How important do you think psychological skills are to your performance and success? Now, this can range, but what we're seeing now as a trend is, of course, over the last 5-10 years or so, maybe going back even a little bit more athletes and more coaches. And as coaches embrace it, of course, athletes are going to embrace it as well. That number is going to climb up, meaning that more people are perceiving the importance of psychological skills to overall performance and success. It's not just physical anymore. Both sides of the coin, physical and psychological, are just as important. Couple myths that we see. PST is only for problem athletes, right? Athletes that aren't clutch, athletes that can't work within a team, athletes that are really aggressive, athletes, well, of course, PST can help them, but these skills can help everybody. Again, even those athletes that aren't perceived as quote unquote problem athletes, they can still benefit from this type of training. PST is only for elite athletes only. Again, I talked about how although those athletes, again, the Olympic athletes, the Division I athletes, the professional athletes, they may have more financial resources, capability, and sometimes time to do it. It can benefit anyone of all age groups. Skills training, just like, well, this type of skills training, psychological skills training, just like physical training, does not provide a quick fix. When someone has to get stronger, build more muscle in the weight room, before they start to see any sort of change, it's going to take a couple weeks. And as they get into the growth of muscle, it's going to take a couple months and longer as they try to maintain what they work on. Same thing here. Athletes can't get into this expecting to go to one session, 2 sessions, and to completely improve in the way that they're seeking to improve, because again, it's not a quick fix solution, just as physical training is not a quick fix solution. To tie to another example, maybe one that's more technical, when a team is learning a play, yes, they may learn the basics of the play, after a practice or two, but for them to really master that play, there needs to be repetitions, practicing that play in different settings against different teams. Same thing here. The skills that these athletes learn, the psychological skills, they have to be practiced against different opponents, in different environments at different times throughout the day, throughout the course of a practice of a game. Again, same type of philosophy here. And I think the last one is one that hopefully I believe coaches, like I said, are leaning towards really erasing, where there's more of an embracing again of the fact that the psychological side of sport is just as important as the physical side. So of course, there needs to be, and there will continue to be, as we start to embrace the psychology of sport, the fact that these skills are very useful. So now let's get into these skills. It's a proven technique, right? These types of skills, but at the same time, as I said, the people that use these skills, the athletes that decide to practice these skills, they need to be realistic. They can't explain, or they can't expect, excuse me, to completely improve a certain way that's unrealistic, right? They need to have realistic goal setting and the things that they want to improve upon. And at the same time, if it doesn't work after just a couple of times of trying it, they can't give up on it, and they can't say, it's useless, especially if they don't give it a chance. I made this reference earlier, just like a play, just like the technical skills, psychological skills can be learned, but again, must be practiced and integrated into daily routines to be very successful and effective. Research supports PST. Ultimately, research tells us that athletes who engage in psychological skills training, they're typically more successful because of these reasons. They have a higher degree of confidence. They have greater self-regulation of arousal. They know how to control their stress, their anxiety a little bit more, and they're able to understand what it means to perform in pressure and under pressure. They have better communication skills, and this becomes very helpful if they are in a leadership role, whether it's a formal role or an informal role, because they can help those around them improve. They have more positive thoughts and images, and of course, there's tons of psychology research that backs that up in terms of having a better outcome, better performance when there is positive thoughts and images involved, more determination, more commitment. Research backs up PST. PST, psychological skills training, as you can imagine, is a very wide-ranging topic, or I should say, a very wide-ranging category of skills. Some of the skills that probably are most useful and the ones that have the most research and the ones that are most talked about, I think the ones that we're going to focus on for the remainder of the semester include skills associated with the topics of arousal regulation, so helping people keep their cool under, as I just mentioned, pressure situations. When things become stressful, people build anxiety. Imagery and mental preparation, so people helping themselves, athletes helping themselves visualize things that they need to help improve. Confidence building, particularly those that have poor confidence in certain situations, increasing motivation, commitment, goal setting, that becomes huge. And we're going to get into goal setting later on in the semester. Attention, concentration, improving those things as well. Self-talk, positive self-talk, mental plans, and imagery. So in order for someone to execute, to implement a psychological skills training, they need to go through 3 phases. They need to go through an education phase, an acquisition phase, and a practice phase. As you would expect in the education phase, this is where the athletes learn the nuts and bolts of what's going on. They understand, one, the fact that psychology of sport is just as important as the physicality of sport. They understand their own limitations, and then they also realize that they need to, not only once they learn these skills, spend time with these skills, practicing them, incorporating them into their everyday lives. And I think this is where those realistic expectations are actually set. In the acquisition phase, this is, really more of the practice phase. Skills might be tweaked by the sports psychologist or the coach who's ever using these skills with the athlete to help tailor the skills potentially to what the person needs. So there's a high degree of individuality in this stage. And then again, once the skills are learned, the biggest point of emphasis here is practice. So in the education phase, the athlete's learning the skills, they know what they have to do. In the acquisition phase, there's plenty of time spent here for the athletes practicing the skills, and then the person providing the skills to the athletes, they're potentially tailoring tailoring specific skills to the individual. Practice phase. So now that the practice has continued to take place, the practice moves on to become self-sufficient. So before they were practicing with the person who, perhaps was giving them these skills, but now the athletes on their own. They're learning psychological skills. They're progressing from just practice and simulations to actual competitions. So they're putting their skills in play. They're self-dependent. They're independent. They understand how to document the skills that they're using. They chart progress. They provide feedback to the person who gave them the skills in the first place and say, hey, I tried this and this worked for me, or I didn't like how this made me feel, or I like this, how this made me feel, or I had this thought when I tried this, or I tried saying this to myself, but it didn't work out so well. And that conversation, that dialogue allows the person giving the skills to the athlete and the athlete themselves to go back into the acquisition phase, tailor some things to the individual needs of the athlete, practice together, and then head back into the practice phase where, again, there's more of that sense of autonomy and the athlete is working again a little bit more on them within themselves to execute these skills. So I mentioned as part of the first phase, education phase, there needs to be an understanding of not only the skills, the actual nuts and bolts of how to do something, but also the person, the coach or the sports psychologist teaching the skills needs to understand what or who is the kind of athlete that I'm working with. They need to assess the baseline mental skills of the athlete. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And I think the most important reasons, there's really two most important reasons, are because one, having a good understanding of the baseline mental skills of the athlete helps the person who's providing the skills understand recommendations for what particular skills training may work, what may not work, what may be more effective. And again, some of that may be, most of that really will be grounded in research. And the rest of that a little bit will be grounded in trial and error. Second part of it is understanding how much work has to be done, and particularly if there's certain areas in which the athlete struggles in. And then the person providing the skills to the athlete knows where they have to spend most of their time, in particular in the acquisition phase, as they tailor the programs, tailor the skills training to the athlete's individual needs. In the text, there are these 5 concepts highlighted. And again, the process of understanding what skills an athlete has entails all of these things: assessing strengths and weaknesses, understand, perhaps using assessment techniques, right? There could be questionnaires. That's what an inventory is. There can be interviews. There can be note taking, right? Just asking questions generally of, again, what types of skills they have, whether it's related to mental toughness, whether it's related to confidence, whether it's related to other aspects of the sport, getting their experience level, getting their understanding of how important psychological skills training is to them. If from the beginning, you ask an athlete, why are you here today to be involved in psychological skills training? And their response is, well, my coach told me to be here. And I don't believe in any of this stuff, and my coach wants me to be here. There's going to have to be a little bit of work on the practitioner side to help the athlete embrace the fact that, again, you're not just here because your coach wants you to be here. You're here because this is important, but also because this is really another part of your game, part of your ability to compete, that's going to help improve the other part, the physical side, the technical side as well. So again, that's an important transition of a mindset to have. Consider the unique demands of the sport. Different athletes are going to behave differently, but again, biggest difference being if they're involved in a team dynamic or a more individual based dynamic, team sport versus individual sport. Before the program begins, it's never a bad idea to have a general observation of the athletes, see how they are on a day-to-day basis from practice to practice, game to game. Even if it's for a short period of time, for a week, 2 weeks, maybe even a couple of days at the least, to understand where psychological skills training could potentially fit into their daily routines, and ultimately, and I touched a little bit upon this when I mentioned the coach, but ask for the perspectives of other people involved, teammates. How does this player, and you have to, obviously you want to be a little bit careful when you talk to teammates, there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it, of course. But you can ask teammates, what do you generally think of this player? Or has this player expressed these thoughts to you or these thoughts? You can ask similar types of questions to obviously the coach, the head coach, the different types of coaches that may be on the staff, athletic trainers. That's a huge part to dive into, because a lot of times, um, you know, probably some athletes that could benefit a lot, and all athletes could really benefit, of course, like we keep saying, from psychological skills training, but some athletes that may be specifically recommended for psychological skills training, and it's related to injury, perhaps they may be very well already expressing a lot of these things that you would want to know, a lot of the things you'd want to know as it relates to understanding baseline mental skills, to athletic trainers, to other healthcare providers, because from my experience, as an athletic trainer, in addition to the other things I've done and still do, the athletic training facility, whether it's at the high school level, the professional level, anywhere, becomes the dumping ground for what? For the stress of the day, the worries of the day, the ongoing worries, the ongoing stresses. So a lot of drama, if you would say, for lack of a better word, gets spilled in the athletic training facility. So again, that's something definitely to consider. So when you think about putting these programs to use, who does them? And I know I keep saying, kind of vaguely, I keep saying the people who implement these programs. And I say that because it could really be a couple people. Most often it's a sports psychologist, someone, again, who is, we talked about those different disciplines, those different domains of sports psychology, someone that obviously has training in this. Coaches can do this as well, but of course coaches want to be careful, because as you see there's a clear potential conflict of interest when coaches are involved in implementing the program. And both can do this. These skills can implement these skills as long as they're aware of their own limits. Again, they're not overstepping their boundaries, right? They're not doing things like diagnosing if they're not able to, if it's outside of their scope. They're not making recommendations that are outside their scope. They're not asking their athletes to do things that are not in their training. And something that I've seen from experience is probably when it is coaches that are teaching these skills to their athletes, the time it works best is probably when you have different coaches that aren't the head coaches responsible for these skills. So in other words, it's not the head coach that's working individually with the athletes to work on these skills. Although these skills are important, and again, I keep mentioning how the psychological side of sport is just as important as the physical side of sport, you can't take away from the physical side. That's important too. So ideally, you want to implement these types of skills in the off season when there's more time. Hopefully the education phase, the acquisition phase, does take place in the off season, and then as the season goes on, the athletes can compete while in the practice phase of their skills training, because again, that's going to let them, kind of trial and error, and finally put to use in real practice, real game level, the skills that they've been practicing or trying to work on, trying to learn in the off season. And just like physical exercise, you got to put in the time. So typically to implement these skills, and again, this can vary based on what particular skills are being learned and how many skills are being learned. And again, the baseline mental skills level of the athlete as they start to engage in PST training, or just psychological skills training. This training, typically the recommendation we have is you want to last 10 to 15 minutes a day working with the athlete, and 3 to 5 days per week. And again, it may not seem like a lot, but definitely once the education phase, the acquisition phases are done, consistency becomes key, logging progress becomes key, And, if an athlete can become self-sufficient in doing this 3 to 5 days a week, whether they do it before every game, they have multiple games throughout the week or multiple practices throughout the week, that can be effective. That could be an easy way for them to maintain consistency. If they kind of work it into their routine, that could be just as important to them as stretching or getting taped or something related to that. Obviously, just like physical practice, when the learning of these skills takes place, the practice of it starts from just practice situations, and then there should be simulations, and then there should be an ability as the athlete progresses from the education phase into the acquisition phase and then into the practice phase, to be able to implement the skills to real game situations. Now, the back end, and this is a shorter presentation today, but the back end of this presentation, I just want to quickly highlight here that because of these different skills, and we're going to get to see how technology is used in some of those skills that we mentioned earlier, like goal setting, and arousal control and positive self-talk. There's been a lot of progress made in this area, and particularly using things like virtual reality, eye tracking to track certain things, or eye tracking obviously to track eye movement in certain scenarios. Two of the many examples that exist, many of the technologies that are out there right now that help coaches, help sports psychologists better train their athletes in these types of skills. All right, so now we're going to watch a series of 2 short videos. The first short video is a collegiate ice hockey player who discusses his preparation pregame. So he talks about his mental preparation pregame, what he does to get himself mentally prepared before the start of every game. And it's clear that in this video, you can see that this athlete has embraced the fact that there's some level of psychological skills training that he can put forth already in the practice phase that really complements his day-to-day routine. So let's go ahead and check this video out.
AJ, when given your years of playing, we know people mentally prepare in a lot of different ways. Some guys are quiet, some keep it loose, some take a long time to think about the game, others like to distract themselves. How would you describe how you learned how to mentally prepare for performing at your best?
Well, it's a lot of trial and error, and I was fortunate that I was kind of made aware that getting prepared for a game is a really specific process for every person. So what I kind of learned after all of those years of trying different, being too serious and getting too pumped up, or just being really loose and letting it happen, I found that if I was really loose leading up to kind of the getting dressed stage, I like to kind of goof around in our team stretches and stuff. And then when the game time got closer, I would kind of become more self-reflective. I would think about what I wanted to accomplish. I'd set goals for the game. I had a coach who introduced me to that. And so that was something I used, and visualizing what I wanted to have happen during the game was also important, and just having some set objectives that I could really focus on that would equal success for me at the end.
So he talked a lot about a lot of the skills that we mentioned so far. So there was conversation of imagery, goal setting. There's a couple other things embedded in there. And I really like that video because I don't want you to fall into the trap of, as we're learning these things in class, of quite frankly being bored with them. Because although it may seem like a lot goes into sports psychology and a lot does go into sports psychology, ultimately, when you look at the finished product in terms of how the things that we're covering, stemming from themes, approaches, and now getting into individual skills that we can improve upon, it all makes sense, right? It all should click. So, he said that for him, a lot of what he worked on was trial and error. And I think that's huge because certain skills, just like certain physical skills, are going to work better for some athletes and not for others. And really the best way to figure that out is, again, trial and error. And he was fortunate enough that through his, definitely sounds like he's a, junior or a senior at this point. It sounds like through his experience, he was able to find a formula that worked for him to get himself ready using a combination of skills training. And again, staying in that practice phase of those skills and being able to use them on a weekly basis, incorporate them into his daily routine and so forth. The second video we're going to watch now, in this video, we have Dr. Missy Wright. So here she's working with a professional tennis player who, obviously is, seeking her help, Dr. Missy Wright's help. And what's really cool about this video is we get a breakdown, we get to see an example of how a coach, in this case, a sports psychologist, Dr. Missy Wright, will use a program, tailor it specifically to the skills that she wants and obviously the athlete wants to work on and progress through the education, acquisition, and practice phase. Let's go ahead and watch this.
All right, Emily, let's actually talk a little bit about what makes a good mentally tough tennis player.
Well, I think you have to have the right amount of confidence.
Okay. Confidence. And you say right amount, is there?
I mean, I think there's a thin line between confidence and cocky. I
Okay.
think if you're cocky, that can damage you.
Okay.
Overconfidence. I think you have to be determined.
Okay. Yeah. So wanted. Yeah.
Right. You have to stay positive.
Okay. These are good. Anything else you think?
I guess you just have to deal with the pressure.
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the reasons you're in here, right? Is, figuring that stuff out, learning how to deal with pressure, and like you talked about the stress and maybe going on to university and balancing that.
Right.
So pressure, dealing with pressure. Okay. Yeah. Anything else?
You just have to be focused.
Sure.
Stay focused.
Focused on the right things.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Good focus. Right.
I think that's something that I struggle with, is staying focused.
Okay. All right. Well, actually, one exercise that I really like to do, especially on this first day when we get to know each other, is going through some of these things that make a tennis player mentally tough. And you name 5, probably some of the top 5 right there, right? Excellent. Then what I want to do is taking these 5, I want to start placing them around the circle. And then we're going to start talking about what do they look like and actually how important are they? Where are you at right now with them? All right, so we're going to get into that activity a little bit. All right, Emily, so this is a performance profile. And what you see here is actually 8 different pieces of a pie. You want to think of this as like a mental toughness pie. It's made up of 8 different pieces. We went through about 5, probably a really good 5 that you pointed out. And you've now written those 5 different mental skills around the pie. So the purpose of this is to sort of take an inventory of where you're at with these mental skills right now. And then we'll probably revisit this in maybe a few months, 6 months, even maybe in a year, and just see where we at. So you first have an idea of where are you at right now. We'll probably set some goals of where you want to be. So maybe there might be 1 or 2 areas that you might be a little low on, or that you might even be average on and you want to make it great. And so the goal of this is to just get an inventory, and then we're going to set some goals on what areas that we really want to work on. And then we'll be able to revisit this later on just to see what sort of progress we've made in these areas. Okay. Any questions on this part?
And again, here's our baseline measure of our mental skills. A lot of different ways to do this. This is one of many. But remember, this can be done not only with profiles like this, but even just general interview questions, different questionnaires that are out there, so on and so forth.
No, does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So what one do you want to start with?
Let's just start with confidence.
Okay, so first, let's talk a little bit about confidence. You talked before about not being overconfident. So what does a confident tennis player look like?
Shoulders back, chin up, just always pumping themselves up, never getting down about themselves.
Excellent. Okay. So thinking about that, where do you think you'd rank? So if that is a 1, the little baby pie right there, and this would be all the way to a 10. If you say maybe you gave yourself a 4, you'd shade 1, 2, 3, 4, and you'd shade that in.
Yeah.
Okay. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you think you are with confidence?
I'd say I'm probably a 5.
Excellent. Okay. So let's have you shade that in. Excellent. Looks good. Do you want to work the way around with pressure?
Yeah.
Okay. So with pressure, what comes to mind with that?
I guess when you're in a high pressure situation.
So hopefully by now you're picking up on the general idea. She'll go through, fill the pie based on how she perceives herself to be. So let's go forward just a little bit here, see what the finished product looks like.
Important ones. As I said a few minutes ago, it's not necessarily about the one that you're weakest at that you might want to work on. But I think I want to choose maybe 1 or 2 for us to focus our attention on as these mental skills that we can work on in these next few months. So is there anything really jumping out at you that you really want to direct some attention to?
Definitely being more focused.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be one that we could really make some big gains with. Excellent. Okay. Focus. Good. And is there any other that you want to?
I really want to build my confidence.
Okay.
I think that's what separates a good player from a great player.
Sure.
Is your confidence.
Yeah, and I think those can really go hand in hand too. That's great. So we'll set our goals with those, and those will be your goals that we'll work on together. And then we'll probably actually revisit this in a few months and just check in, take a look at this, and maybe even do another performance profile just to see if, where we're making some changes and where we're making some strides. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good job.
Thank you.
And the thing I really liked about that is Dr. Missy Wright, she didn't force the athlete to work on certain things. Instead, she encouraged the athlete to choose to self-perceive how she currently felt about the skills that she had, and the athlete decided what she wanted to work on. So again, that becomes much more powerful, and it makes it a little bit easier for the sports psychologist or the coach, because they know instead of having to work on everything at the same time, as you heard Dr. Wright say there at the end, there can be some things that are chosen as points of emphasis, which in this case, they want to work on the athlete's confidence and focus to help see the best improvements in a shorter period of time. All right, so let's go back over here. And then not much left here, so just hang with me here. Something I do want to just bring up here to wrap this up as it pertains to using these skills training. These are just general recommendations that the text provides as it pertains to Olympic athletes using psychological skills training. Keep in mind that, like we said, one of the myths is that PST is only for elite athletes. So that being said, these skills, although they are, at least for now, specifically referencing Olympic athletes, you can very easily see how a lot of these guiding principles should and can relate to athletes of all competition levels, of all ages, and so forth. So I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly. Again, they probably sound really familiar at this point. I'm sure I've said a bunch of them already. Mental training can't replace physical training. Physical training is just as important as mental training, and vice versa. Both need to be done to succeed consistently. Just physicality alone is not enough. Something that's really interesting that I like is this guideline. A strong mind may not win an Olympic medal, but a weak mind will lose you one. So I like that guideline, that quote a lot. Coaches frequently don't know what their athletes are thinking. That's very true. They may think they know what their athletes are thinking. That is very common, but it's very rare that they actually know exactly what the thoughts are taking place. There's no denying that thoughts affect behavior. So the more consistent an athlete can be in what they're thinking when they're doing certain things, the more consistent you can expect that behavior to be. And if the behavior is good, coinciding with some good thoughts, then you want to maintain that as much as possible. And then lastly, coaches have varying views of changing technical mistakes versus mental mistakes. Again, this goes back into, whether or not a coach is willing to embrace the importance of psychology as well as physicality in sport. For mental health, or I should say psychological skills training to be the most successful, coaches have to be involved, whether or not they're the exact person doing the skills, encouraging the skills, they have to be involved in some level. Sometimes making these skills part of training is not a bad thing. What that means is that some days, instead of there always being that physical practice where something's always physically done, there's no harm if in encouraging, especially if it's a lighter practice, if it's a day that allows for it, or making time specifically for it, to encourage this side of training. There needs to be a level of memorization, practice, and coaches themselves need to think about their own limitations, because if they have flaws that they themselves had as athletes or have as coaches from the psychological skills training side of things, they want to make sure they don't carry those things over to their athletes that they're coaching. And to wrap things up, most of the time, what we see is as a means of barriers to implementing psychological skills training, lack of conviction. People don't believe in it. So it's up to sports psychologists, coaches to embrace the importance and, educate sometimes their athletes, hence the education phases, 3 phases that were part of the implementation of psychological skills training. Make them believe the truth, which is, hey, psychology is just as important as the physicality of sport. Lack of time. Sometimes this could be a barrier that's a little tough to get around, but then the question becomes is, what are you doing physically from the physical side, from the technical side, that is redundant or that can be replaced with psychological skills training? That doesn't mean to replace it entirely, because again, you can't ignore the physical side of things, but what that does mean is that maybe things such as, running laps, or doing a drill that the team understands, just doing it for the sake of doing it, over practicing, because that is a thing at times. If that is occurring, then that's when you could definitely fit in psychological skills training. Lack of knowledge or sport, it's if the athlete themselves is new to the sport, sometimes that could serve as a barrier. If the coach is new to coaching the sport, they don't have a lot of experience playing the sport, that could be a barrier. And even sometimes if a sports psychologist doesn't fully understand the sport and they try to get involved in a particular sport, they may be missing out parts of the skills that they could really help the athlete with. And a lack of follow-up. These skills can't be seen as a gimmick. It can't just be seen as, I'll try for a week or two and then kind of drop it, or I'll spend off season working on it, but then never use it throughout the season. Because if that's the case, then it's sort of like a waste of time, because then you're learning something new and not using it. It's the equivalent of learning a new language. Say if you spend this previous summer learning a language, but then as you got out of the summer, once you felt as if you learned the language at least at a conversational level, but then never used it again, never talked to anyone, never wrote in it, never read in that language, then those skills, not only you're never going to get to use them, but they're going to diminish rather quickly. And then before you know it, if you try to use that skill, that language again, you're going to be very poor in that category. So same type of thought with these skills. Once they are learned, once the athletes go through the education phase, the acquisition phase, and if that practice phase is ignored, then you can't really cement these skills into the repertoire that athletes have. So there you have it. That's an introduction in psychological skills training. There are a lot of these skills. We're going to talk about a bunch of them as the semester goes on. Maybe you can try some of these yourselves, and you should. And if you find yourself in a situation in the future which you get to talk about these skills or use some of these skills that we're going to talk about, make sure you keep in mind the underlying principles that we've covered today.